All right, welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. It's funny, we talk about all sorts of things on this show, but I think today's topic is one of the most fundamental ones we've ever really tackled.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's a big one.
Yeah,
How about this? What is the difference, if there even is one, between mind and matter?
exactly. And then the next question, how could we even know? I mean, it's not like we can just, measure it, right? Luckily, we have some help unpacking all of this, and specifically, we're looking at the work of Alfred Binet and his book, The Mind and the Brain.
Yeah, Benet's work is so helpful here, especially because this isn't just some, abstract philosophy.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
has real implications for how we understand, like, our own experiences every day, but also how we do science.
Yeah.
The whole shebang.
Absolutely. And so today our mission is to really navigate these ideas that Binet lays out, make sure they make sense for everyone, and hopefully give you, the listener, some useful insights. And all that without getting too bogged down in academic jargon. We want to make sure this is clear and understandable for everyone.
Absolutely. I'm not all for that.
So let's dive right in. One of the first things that really stood out to me in The Mind and the Brain is this starting point that Binet lays out. He starts with this really simple, but I think profound observation.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It's the idea that, well, there's just something knowable out there, right?
Okay, yeah. I see.
I mean, whether it's
Good.
scientists trying to figure out how the universe works or just us sitting around talking about the weather, we all have this basic assumption, there's stuff we can actually know,
Right, yeah, that makes sense. So we start with this idea that there is a knowable world. What's next?
Okay, well, so then the next thing, and I think we all do this intuitively, is that we look around at this knowable world and we're immediately struck by just how incredibly diverse it is.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's wild out there.
And so what do? Well, we start sorting things,
Yeah.
categorizing, just trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah. We can't help it. Color, shape, whether we like something, whether it's alive or not, it never ends.
Right, and I think this is such a human thing to do. We're constantly making distinctions, drawing lines, trying to bring order to the complexity.
Oh, absolutely. It's how we make sense of the deluge of information, that constant flood coming at us. We got to categorize and make sense of it all. I mean, it's really overwhelming otherwise.
Absolutely. And this is where Binet introduces a really insightful critique, and he calls it the method of concepts.
The method of concepts.
But basically what he's saying is that we often throw around these big abstract words, words like mind, without really taking the time to really examine what we even mean by them,
I see what you're saying, yeah. So we use the word, but do we really know what it means?
Exactly. We haven't really dug into their specific characteristics. And she makes this really interesting analogy to a banker who accepts a promissory note without actually checking if it's going to be paid, just taking it at face value.
Oh, that's a great analogy. So there's a danger then in just accepting these big, broad concepts without digging deeper, sort of taking them on faith.
Right. And so the key takeaway here for you, the listener, is that we really need to be careful about the assumptions that are sort of baked into these big words we use, especially words like mind, that we're talking about today.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that there might be a lot more to these concepts than we initially realize. It's easy to have this superficial understanding, right? That we can toss these words around mind and matter without truly grappling with their actual content. It's like, as you were saying with the word red, we kind of get what that means, but mind, oh boy, that's loaded with all sorts of unspoken baggage.
Exactly. And all of this then leads us to this really fundamental question that our source raises. And it's this: can we actually find a violent, a lasting, and an indelible contrast, a real clear separation between this idea of mind and literally everything else in the knowable world?
Right. So is there a fundamental and unbridgeable gap?
Yes. Is there a line in the sand? On one side, mind, and on the other side, everything else. It's this age-old question.
Yeah.
And I think we intuitively feel that there's a difference, right?
Yeah, we do. But can we actually define that difference in a really rigorous way? Definitively. Luckily, Binet dives right into one common attempt to draw that distinction.
Okay, tell me more.
So often, how this argument goes is that matter gets reduced down to this idea of, movement.
Okay, like atoms and particles always zipping around.
Exactly, constantly in motion. And then on the other hand, you have mind. And this, of course, includes being alive, feeling emotions, making judgments, the whole 9 yards.
Right, all those good things.
And so the argument goes that mind gets reduced to this idea of thought. So you have this neat little separation, right? Movement for matter, thought for mind, case closed. Seems pretty simple.
Yeah, it does sound kind of clean and straightforward.
But the source, thankfully, throws a wrench in the whole thing and says, hold on a second.
Hmm.
And it emphasizes this thing called the principle of heterogeneity.
Oh, okay, here we go.
And the argument here, and this is where it gets good, is that there's a really, really fundamental, like, just absolute difference between movement, which at its core is just a change in physical location, right?
Okay, yeah.
Like something moves from point A to point B, but then you have thought and think about like a desire, a feeling of joy or sadness, or my favorite example, the sensation of tasting something bitter. These two things, thought and movement, just seem utterly different in kind, you know?
Yeah, I see that. I mean, there's a big difference, right? Like a movement is a displacement, a very physical thing.
Hmm.
But a thought or a feeling, like what is the direct, like physical equivalent of bitterness? It doesn't really seem to exist, does it?
Precisely. It's like comparing apples and, well, not even oranges. It's more like comparing apples to the abstract idea of orangeness,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, I like that. And so what our source is arguing then is that these two categories, movement and thought, are so fundamentally different, so wildly different, that their distinction shouldn't even be thought of as like an analogy, but as a core principle, like a foundational truth.
Exactly. There's just no inherent similarity between a geometrical fact like movement and a subjective experience like a desire. It's a huge difference.
Right. Okay, so we have this idea of mind and matter, and we're trying to figure out how they're different, if at all, and we're also trying to avoid falling into the trap of just accepting these big concepts without really examining them.
Right. Absolutely. Got to be rigorous here.
So this brings us to this really interesting concept, sensation. And the way Binet introduces it is as this kind of intermediary, something that stands between the objects out there in the world, the stuff we bump into, and our own minds, how we understand and perceive things.
Right. So it's like this middleman between the external world and our internal world of cognition, of knowing.
Exactly. And I think what's really cool here is that the source uses this word sensation in a really neutral way at first. It doesn't immediately jump into saying whether it's fundamentally material or mental. It's like holding back a bit.
Ah, so there's a strategy there. The source is trying to lay the groundwork, building an argument without jumping to conclusions. So it's just acknowledging this basic idea that our interaction with the world outside our minds is mediated. It goes through this thing called sensation. It's how we take in information. And that, I think, leads to a question for you, the listener.
Oh, okay. Lay it on me.
Why do we even think that external perception has to be mediated in the first place? Like, why not just perceive things directly as they truly are? What's the need for this extra step?
That's a great question. It's like, why the middleman? And that's where the second really key observation comes in. And I think this is one of those fascinating parts of this whole discussion.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with it.
So our source points out that the sensations we have, like the actual experience of seeing, hearing, tasting, all that, don't necessarily give us this like completely accurate, unfiltered view of the world. Like it's not a perfect mirror,
Yeah.
And a lot of this comes from a major scientific discovery called the law of specific nerve energies that was found by a guy named Mueller.
Oh, this is a game changer. Miller's Law is really one of those things that makes you rethink how we experience the world. Because it basically says that what kind of sensation you have, like whether you see, hear, or feel something, depends more on which sensory nerve is being stimulated than what is actually happening in the real world, like physically.
So it's more about how our bodies are wired up than what's actually out there.
Exactly. So think about this, right? Like you could have the same exact event happening in the real world, but if it triggers different nerves, you'll have a totally different experience. The key takeaway here for you, the listener, is that your experience of the world, like what you see, hear, and feel, is fundamentally shaped, like really sculpted by your biology. It's not just about what's objectively out there.
That is so trippy to think about. It's like my reality is being created by my body. Okay, but can you give some concrete examples? I think this is where it gets super interesting and helps it really click.
Absolutely. So picture this. You apply an electrical current to the eye.
Okay, that sounds unpleasant, but okay.
Yeah, not recommended for at-home experiments, but for science. So you apply this electrical current to the eye, and what do you experience? You see light.
Okay, so the electricity is somehow triggering the seeing nerves.
Exactly. Now, take that exact same electrical current and apply it to the ear. What happens? You'll probably hear a crackling sound.
Whoa, so the same input, electricity, but different outputs depending where it goes. That is so wild.
It is. And it gets even weirder. Apply that same electricity to the hand, and you'll feel a shock, like, a zap. And if you apply it to your tongue, you might get a metallic taste.
So even though it's the same electricity every time, my brain interprets it as light, sound, touch, or taste, depending on which nerve is getting zapped. This is blowing my mind.
Right. It really shows you how much our experience is shaped by our own sensory systems.
And to make it even trippier, you were saying that the reverse is true too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So imagine different things happening to your eye. You could have actual light hitting your eye, or you could press on your eyeball gently, of course,
Yeah.
or, and don't try this at home, you could apply an electrical current or even cut the optic nerve.
Okay, ouch. That last one sounds particularly bad.
Agreed. But here's the thing, all of those wildly different things, if they stimulate the optic nerve in any way, will result in the same basic sensation light.
So it doesn't matter if it's photons from the sun or my finger poking my eye, my brain says, hey, light, as long as the optic nerve is involved. Wow.
It's wild, right? It completely throws a wrench in the idea that our sensations, what we see, hear, and feel, are just these direct, perfect representations of the world. It's much more complex than that.
For sure. Okay, so this makes me wonder then, what does the source ultimately conclude about all of this?
Well, the source is very careful here. It doesn't jump to conclusions, but it basically says that we really don't know, for sure, to what extent our sensations actually resemble or differ from the real objects that are out there causing them. It's an open question.
Okay, so it's not like we can just assume that what we see is what's really there. It's all filtered and shaped by our own sensory systems.
Precisely. And that, I think, is a really, really important takeaway for everyone.
Okay, so all of this talk about sensation, and we still haven't really answered the main question. What's the deal with mind and matter?
Right. And to be honest, we're not going to give you a definitive answer today. But we are going to unpack how Binet helps us think about it.
Okay, that sounds way more interesting than just a simple answer anyway. So where do we go from here?
So if we can't totally rely on our senses to give us a clear picture of reality, what do we do?
Yeah, how do we even approach this question of mind and matter?
Well, Binet suggests kind of a shift in focus. Instead of getting bogged down in deciding if sensations are mind or matter right off the bat, he says, let's just take a closer look at what we normally think of as belonging to the mind. Let's just make a list.
Okay, so kind of like taking inventory of all the stuff that seems mindish.
Yeah, what are the phenomena that we all kind of agree are mental? So, what's on the list? Sensations, perceptions, ideas, memories, all kinds of thoughts, emotions, feelings, desires, imagination. Oh, and let's not forget those acts of attention and, focusing on something or making a decision. It's a long list.
Wow, that really is the full range of inner experiences.
Right. And it's interesting because Binet notices that all this stuff, all these mental phenomena, can be divided into two big categories. Objects of cognition, which are the things we're aware of, and acts of cognition, which are the processes of knowing, perceiving, judging, all that.
So it's like, on the one hand, we have the stuff of our mental lives, feelings, images, memories. And on the other hand, we have what our mind does with that stuff. How we think about it, react to it. It's like data and software.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And I think by making that distinction, Binet is setting us up to go deeper, how do these two categories relate to this big, mysterious question of mind and matter?
That's such a great point. We've covered so much ground already, but it really feels like we're just getting started.
And we are. But let's take a moment to recap what we've learned from Binet so far.
Okay, that's a great idea. So we started with the very idea of there being a knowable world, right? There's stuff out there we can actually understand.
Exactly. But then right away, we bump into this problem of well, how much can we really know? Our senses, it turns out, aren't perfect mirrors of reality.
Right. They're shaped by our bodies, by our biology. So that throws a wrench into things.
Big time. And so Binet says, okay, let's not get too hung up on labeling everything as mind or matter right away. Instead, let's just take a really close look at what we generally consider mental and try to categorize it, break it down.
And that led to that awesome list of all sorts of mental phenomena like sensations, perceptions, thoughts, emotions, and so on.
Right. And then we saw that Binet divides all that stuff into two groups. Objects of cognition, which are the things we're aware of, and acts of cognition, which are the mental processes themselves.
So much good stuff.
Yeah.
And I think what really stood out to me is how Binet seems to be leaning towards this view that sensation, at least the part that connects to those external objects, is actually physical. It's like the building blocks of our understanding of the world outside our minds.
Yeah. It's a fascinating perspective. And the source even hints at this idea that mind and matter might be what we call correlative terms, which is like a fancy way of saying that they depend on each other.
Okay, I think I'm following. So it's like you can't have one without the other.
Exactly. Think of it like form and matter, that old philosophical idea. Or even a lock and key. You can't really understand one without the other.
Right, that makes sense. It's like they fit together somehow.
Exactly. And this kind of throws a wrench into those classic views of like spiritualism, where the mind is totally separate from matter.
Yeah, or materialism, where the mind is just a product of matter.
Right. They both run into problems when you try to figure out how the mind and body interact.
Right. If they're totally separate, how do they even communicate?
Yeah.
And if the mind is just a product of matter, how come it feels so different?
Big questions. And Binet even mentions this idea of parallelism, which is a way some materialists try to get around this whole mind-body problem. It's like imagining two films running side by side, perfectly in sync. You have a material sequence and a mental sequence always happening together, but they never actually touch.
So it's like they're happening at the same time, but in totally separate realms.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, and I think it highlights just how tricky this whole mind and matter thing really is.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, I want to hear more about Binet's own take on all of this. Like, how does he think perception actually works?
Okay, so remember how we were talking about the nervous system and how it shapes our sensations?
Yeah, like how the same electrical current can make us see light or hear a sound, depending on which nerve gets zapped.
Exactly. So Binet takes that idea and runs with it. He suggests that what the nervous system does is it takes that external stimulus, that thing out in the world, and modifies it. And then our consciousness, which is super sensitive to change, picks out the specific part of that modified signal that represents the actual object.
Okay, so it's like the object isn't being created inside our minds.
Mhm.
It's already kind of encoded in that nerve signal.
Right. And our consciousness just sort of unrolls it, extracts the information, like reading data from a source.
So the object is already in there,
Yeah.
in a way, and our minds are just figuring out how to decode it.
Yeah, something like that. And this leads us to a really thought-provoking question for you, dear listener. If this is how perception works, how much of what you perceive as absolutely real, like the ground beneath your feet, the screen in front of you, is actually a construction shaped by your own biology?
Wow, that's a big one.
Yeah.
It's like, how much of my reality is actually my reality?
And if our experience is this, like unrolling of nerve signals, what does that tell us about the nature of truth? Like, is there even such a thing as an objective truth if our experience is always filtered through our senses?
Mind blown. I think I need to go for a walk and process all of this.
Me too.
Yeah.
But I think that's the beauty of Binet's work. He really makes us think about the foundation of our experience. And maybe, just maybe, that's the first step to understanding this age-old mind-matter mystery.
Absolutely. So much to think about. But that's all the time we have for today. Until next time, keep diving deep.
And keep those brains buzzing.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.